Oh, yes, it helps if everybody turns off your camera and mutes yourself. I will, oops, hang on, I lost my, I will break for questions every once in a while, and we will take questions at the end if we have time. But yes, I want to give you a chance for questions. So this is an introduction to the history and culture of China. So I'm trying to compress 5,000 years of history into about an hour and a half to 2 hours. So you can imagine everything I'm going to have to leave out. So what's left out isn't less important. It's just that I've had to pick and choose about what I want to include that's most important for our purposes, which is studying art and related to our collection. It's an introduction that's meant to help you start putting China into perspective. And again, this is 5,000 years of history. And some of us have more knowledge about this than others. For some of us in the class, this may be the first time that you've really learned anything about China. So we're kind of trying to cover the spectrum here. And one thing to get straight as we move on is our terminology. So we don't use the Western Christian-based terminology of BC and AD. We use BCE, which is before Common Era, and CE for Common Era. So the dates are the same. You know, the year 1 is still the same. 1 AD is the same as 1 CE. So this map shows us China. This kind of in 3 different stages. We have the outline here, the green area of which is modern China. And then this is the Tang Empire in about the 7th to 10th centuries, just to give you some perspective of where we're talking about. And of course, over here we have Korea and Japan off to the east. So let's talk about China in more general terms, the geography of China. So it's bounded on four sides. To the east is the ocean, to the west is the mountains and deserts. The north, we have Russia and Mongolia, and then Southeast Asia on the south. China has managed to remain fairly isolated throughout most of its history. There has been contact with the West, but it is protected. The mountains and deserts and oceans protect it. Most of the raids, invasions, and so on have come from the north, from Mongolia. And here we have the geographical regions. Again, toward the east, we have fertile soil, grasses and grains, a lot of agriculture. The greatest population is in the eastern part of China. When you get down south, there's the hill country, extensive rain. When you think of rice and rice cultivation, rice paddies, that is in the southern areas of China. And then as you move into Southeast Asia, up north, of course, think of the grasslands, nomads, and to the south, actually to the west, north, we have the desert, the great deserts, and then of course we have the Himalayan mountains down directly toward the west and toward the south, and the high plateaus, a much more sparse population in this region. And again, this has slowed down the communications with the other great civilizations throughout history: Persia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Europe, and India. And so it's become, this has affected Chinese thought and action in that they are more inward looking. They're more interested in internal integration. Now you're going to see the empires were concerned about expansion, but mostly expansion within this area. And then managing to control the populations and integrate the populations and culture within their borders. Here we have the Yellow River. You can see these cities with the green outlines are really the important centers of the early dynasties. And you can see that the population grew along this Yellow River, and it's known, you know, like the Nile, think of the Nile too, the floods come and go, and this affects agriculture and everything in life. These floods, the Nile floods, were predictable and regular. That's not true of the Yellow River. They were more unpredictable and unknown and can be very devastating. So China currently consists of more than 1.3 billion people. So think about that. Our country, the US, I think we're at about 360 million. So this is at least 3 times our size, more than that. And they consist of 56 different ethnic groups. Though you can see there is a very dominant ethnic group, which is the Han, and which are considered the ethnic Chinese. The Man or the Manchurian come from the north, and the Meng, Mongolian, northern China, but you can see all of these groups really only make up about 8.5% of the population. The second largest majority is the Hui, which are the Muslims, and even at the second greatest, there's still a small segment of the population. And then there are several other minorities listed down there. Now this graphic here, it's just kind of trying to show you the different languages that are spoken throughout China. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. Actually, I think it's coming up for our next slide. If you look at this, so the majority language, or the official language in China, is Mandarin Chinese. And there are various dialects. Now, I am no expert in this. I am just telling you what I know. Some of you may know more about this than I do. So there are different groups of languages, and even though the written language of Mandarin might be the same for each language, the pronunciation is different. So different groups have difficulty communicating with each other. The other large dialect in Chinese is the Cantonese, which is spoken more on the south and coastal. Think Hong Kong. Hong Kong is Canton. So that's where that is mostly spoken. And then there are various other languages from smaller regions, and some languages that are more academic and historical that are rarely used but are important for academic purposes. So I thought this was an interesting graphic. So this is basically back to the year 1, and it just shows you the economic importance of different civilizations at different times. And so you can see when you're back towards year 1, the influence of China and India economically on the in the world population. Now, this is a little, you can see here, they're not including anything really in America, South America, or any of those regions. This is really Western and Northern Hemisphere. But over time, and you can see how dominant the Chinese economy was up, you know, by that large red area up into, look, up into 1820 and here, and then decreases as the United States increases, and as Europe and Japan and India have increased. And then you can see here toward the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, again, China's economy is growing again in relationship to the other economies of the world. And you can is just to me, it was an interesting graphic. It's not going to apply to us too much, but it just gives you a sense of how important China has been throughout history. So if you go way back, the original inhabitants of the area that is now called China migrated out of Africa over 2 million years ago. And the oldest fossil ever discovered, the oldest human fossil ever discovered outside Africa was found in China, and it dates from 100,000 years ago. So the Stone Age or Neolithic period really begins about 8,000 BCE and carries up to 3,000. So what we know of this time period, really, we only know from archaeological finds. And there's a reverence for the ancestor spirits. We can see that beginning about 10,000 years ago in the tomb burials. And this is something that is very important to Chinese culture. And you will be hearing more about this from Pam next week, who's going to talk about the culture of tomb burials and what we know about that. There is a progression, as there is all over the world, from foraging, hunting, gathering, towards farming, and how societies change as they stay in place rather than moving around and develop new levels of complexity, relationships among family and community, and then eventually towards nation. Now here we have this early ceramic. This is from the Met. I'm sorry, it's the Harvard Art Museum's basin with painted geometric decor and burnished surface. So this dates back from 3,300 to 2,600 BCE, and it's earthenware. And then below that, we have a jade object. This is from the Met. It's from the Neolithic period, about 3,500 to 2,000 BC. And it's carved jade, which is a very important element in Chinese culture. And again, we have a number of jade objects in the museum, and you will be getting a lecture on that later about the importance of jade and the difficulty it is to work. You can see that small hole there probably indicates that it's some kind of pendant, or it was attached to something at some point. There's an early civilization, a legendary civilization called the Xia. And I have here the question, myth or fact, because for a long time, there was no archaeological evidence that they existed, but they lived on in stories and myths in Chinese culture. But in 1959, there was a very important discovery made called Erlitou, and they've discovered many objects that relate to an early Neolithic civilization before the Shang, which we will talk about in a moment. So there's objects, there are texts, early writing. There's some indication that there was a calendar, and you can see bronze objects here on the left. This is a bronze wine vessel, and on the right, this is jade again, some jade and turquoise. I'm sorry, what this, yeah, turquoise inlaid bronze plate with an animal mask pattern. So this was unearthed from Erlitou also. There's a great controversy between Eastern and Western scholars on this. The Chinese scholars have done a lot of investigation and say that they have evidence for the Xia, and yes, they absolutely existed. And the Western scholars disagree and say that the investigation was flawed, and they claim that the entire purpose of the investigation was to make China as old as the West, which of course China is as old as the West. So some people argue that this isn't the Xia civilization, but it is an early Shang site. And I also want to say that my pronunciation, I am not Chinese, I don't speak Chinese. So I'm doing my best. We do have some people in the Docent community, Shawei and also Jojo in our own class, who can maybe help a lot of us with some of the pronunciation for these things. So I don't want to put myself forward as any expert on that. Let's talk about timeline here. This is a general overview of the major dynasties, starting with the, it doesn't start with the Xia, it starts with the Shang at 1600 BCE. And then we move forward. This is the list of dynasties and their time periods. This is something more for you to refer back to. And I've brought it up to modern times, and the image on the right is of the Forbidden City. And I'm hoping that I have the correct characters up here as the Mandarin characters for the country of China. Is there a question? I see a chat here. Okay, I don't see what. Oh, okay. Thank you, Jojo. So let's move on. We're going to talk, here's another timeline. Again, I'm not going to go over this, but this is a good reference when we put it onto the website for you to go back to. And it just gives you, again, the dynasties in order and maybe some of the important things that came out of that particular dynasty. So I'm not going to sing for you, but if you can actually, this is a good memory trick. You know, the Shang Zhou Qin Han, Shang Zhou Qin Han, Sui Tong Song, Yuan Mingqing Republic, Yuan Mingqing Republic, Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong. So maybe you can, I guess I did sing for you after all. But so that's just something to help you remember in your mind what the order of the dynasties are. So let's start with the earliest dynasties, the Shang and the Zhou, 1600 to 221 BCE. So this is a long time ago, right? So here we have on the left the expanse of the Shang dynasty and the expanse of the Zhou dynasty. And you'll see inconsistencies in spelling as things are translated into, Chinese is translated into other languages. So you'll see here, I've spelled it with a Z because that's what I've mostly seen, but here on this map, they've spelled it with a C. So that kind of makes your research a little more difficult too. I'm sorry, that's just kind of the way it is. And some things like Mao Zedong, you saw there where I spelled it Z-E-D-O-N-G, that appears to be the most recent way to spell it, but of course we've seen it Mao and then T-S-E and T-O-N-G, so there are many varieties of spelling. So let's talk about the Shang. So the Shang are really the first dynasty where we have a lot of evidence that they exist, and we find them in various areas of China. We find bronze, jade, ceramics, and something called oracle bones, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Zhou, as you move into the Zhou, we find written script that evolves into the modern Chinese character writing. And it's really the height of Chinese bronzeware. So here on the left, this is a Shang rhinoceros. And we have a ritual on the right. We have a ritual wine container that dates to about 1000 to 700 BCE. And then in the center, we have a jade object, this jade dragon pendant that is carved. And you'll notice jade comes in a lot of different colors, not just green. And you will be learning a lot more about that and the importance of jade in Chinese society. So let's take a look at these oracle bones. They were also called dragon bones that were used during the Shang dynasty. So these are made of bones, usually ox bones or turtle shells. And you can see that, look at the characters that are carved on them. And then very interesting. So they would heat a bronze poker and then apply it to the bone with the text, and then it would crack. The heat would crack the shell or the bone, and then these cracks would be read by someone, I don't want to say fortune teller, maybe some kind of shaman, priest, early priest, that would then read these cracks and talk about what it meant, what were the gods trying to communicate to us. So the writing might be a question to the gods about a particular, maybe, are we going to have a good year for rain this year? How are my crops going to do? Or any other topic, and then they would be read. So these are the earliest form of Chinese characters that we have found at this point. And they have evolved over time into modern Chinese characters. Let's talk about these bronzes in the southwest of China. So bronze casting was very important in early China. You can see these date from about 1200 to 1000 BCE. And these were all discovered, a lot of discoveries in since the 1970s through present times, that there have been some amazing things that have completely changed how the history of China is looked at. So during this time, we know that the Shang were an independent kingdom in the southwest of China. We haven't found any, other than the oracle bones and so on, we haven't found any evidence of writing of texts, but it indicates, the location of this indicates that maybe civilization grew in two different areas at the same time, at the Yellow River in the north and along the Yangtze River in the south. And again, we have, yes, these are all bronze ritual objects. So let's talk about something you may have heard of before, which is the axial age. So this is roughly, as I've said here, 800 to 200 BCE. And this is as societies have become more complex, as they're less mobile, and they're able to direct concerns into more spiritual thought, thoughts towards what we might think of as transcendence. We have the birth of many major religious schools that all happened really around this time of the axial age. And you can see that here. We have in China, we have Confucius and Lao Tzu. In Greece, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the birth of Western philosophy. In Persia, Zarathustra. The Middle East, of course, we have Judaism and the Hebrew prophets. And then in India, we have the birth of both Buddhism and Hinduism. So this is all roughly 2,500 years ago. And of course, 2,000 years ago in the Middle East is the birth of Christianity. So just outside of that age. So these ideas and traditions rose independently in these different regions. Of course, there was some communication back and forth, some interaction between these civilizations, but it does appear that these religions grew up separately, independently. So this is, so this really is involved, when you think about philosophical thought, it's really rather, it's a shift towards thinking about the cosmos and how it works, and the way that it works, rather than taking for granted that it just works. It's the rise of second order thinking about how we even think about the universe in the first place and come to know it. So it's really turning away from maybe local deities involved in just objects or locations, and trying to define the order of the entire cosmos, and in order to put our lives into perspective. So some of those that are important to our study and important to China, we'll start with Confucianism. And again, this is a brief introduction. You're going to hear more about this as time goes on. I believe it's coming up next week. So the focus of Confucianism is on filial piety. In other words, honoring our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, and beyond throughout. Keep acknowledging that connection. And it stresses social responsibility. What do we owe to our family? What do we owe to our friends? What do we owe to our community? And it's an effort to create order, to unify people into an orderly society. So this is founded by Confucius, who we believe was born around 500 BCE. And again, so here's Confucius on the left, and we have some other tomb objects that have been discovered. An ox, and this looks like it's a civil servant from either the Sui or the Tang dynasty. Taoism, which means the way. And this focus is on intuitive awareness, and it's your spiritual connection with nature and with other people, rather than just your direct familial relationship. And this was founded by Lao Tzu. And again, here we see alternate spellings of Lao Tzu, about 50 years before Confucius. So very close in time. And we have some Taoist objects here. This is the celestial worthy, this object here. This dates from the Ming dynasty, so much later in time, about, the Ming dynasty was the 1500s up into the 1644 and earlier, from northern China. So it's glazed stoneware. And then we have this painting of cloudy mountainscape from about 1360 to 1370. And here we see the relationship, we see this relationship to nature. And on the right over here, we have Lao Tzu himself. It looks like he's riding on an ox. Now, I'm not sure what the symbolism of that is. And then we're going to talk a little bit about Buddhism for a couple slides, and then maybe we can take some questions if people have them. So Buddhism, of course, was founded, as we learned last semester, those of us who were present for last semester, was actually founded in India by Siddhartha Gautama, again, around 500 BCE. So you can see how in these different regions, these different religions have grown up. So the focus of Buddhism is the release from suffering by detaching from desire. And there's a path that the Buddha has revealed that helps us to become enlightened and liberated from the cycle of reincarnation, which is, of course, being born over and over again, the life, death, birth cycle. So Buddhism came to China around the first century of the Common Era. And here we have what is considered currently to be the earliest known dated Buddha made in China. And this dates from 338 of the Common Era. And these are the Shangtangshan cave complex in Hebei, China. And we have 3 cave sculptures from the Shangtangshan caves. And so I thought I'd show you. This is the caves themselves. So they're actually carved into rock and then lined with these Buddhist sculptures. So devotees could come and contemplate and meditate the teachings of the Buddha. Shangtangshan means the mountain of echoing halls. It's northern China, so in a rural and coal mining area. So there are 11 caves, and they're divided among 3 sites where the major cave construction activity was. And there are a number of these cave complexes, and I believe I've got photos of another one later on in the lecture. So I don't have you viewing here. Does anyone have any questions? You can shout them out, or maybe Jim, if you have something in the chat, Jim can read me the questions. Anybody? So far?
Michelle,
Yes.
this is Becky. I was just wondering, all the paintings and prints and statues and carvings that you've shown us, are they at the museum specifically?
Actually, no, I have actually made an effort. I'm not showing you anything that's in the museum in this lecture.
Okay.
You will, through other people's lectures, you will see objects in the museum, and you will learn about the objects through each other's reports. But for this introduction, I'm trying to put things into perspective. So I'm showing you objects that you might not see in order so that you can better understand how our collection fits into the history.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, anybody else? Shall I move on? So we're going to start here with Qin Shi Huang, who is considered to be the first emperor of China. So his birth name is Xiao Shen, and he was born in 259 BCE, and he was the son of an important king of a large province, and I'll show you that map in a moment. So he ascends the throne of his province of Qin in 246 BCE, but he has a lot more ambition than that. So he becomes the emperor of the Qin dynasty, and Qin Shi Huang means the first sovereign emperor. And you might see these other alternate spellings of his name in your readings. So let's look at the map of China at that time. So you can see the provinces here. So Qin over here is where he came from, Qin Shi Huang. And these are the other important provinces of the area at this time. And notice this zigzag up here. This is the Great Wall of China, or the early editions of the Great Wall of China. And you can see here in this map, this shows you the area that we're talking about. So really, it's just this northeastern area of China. So before Qin, we were in what's called the chaotic warring states period. And Qin, of course, here is the largest and most powerful state. It's very mountainous. It was the residents of this area were considered barbarians, but they were great warriors and great horsemen. So Shen, with his ambition, was ruthless, and any ideas of common ideas of warfare and the rules of warfare, think something like the Geneva Convention, he just ignored all of that. And most of his military, because they did have the horses and they were excellent horsemen, they were really able to conquer these other regions. And he was able to unify them, and we'll talk about how he did that. And he would, as he took over a region, he would melt down their weapons and use that for his for additional weapons for his own army, and also in the construction projects that he did, and for artwork. So what he did, and here you can see a sculpture of him on the right, he centralized power. Instead of having regional areas, he pulled all of the power to the one central state and decreased the power of the local aristocracy in those regions. So he eliminated the borders and divided the empire up into what we call commanderies, 36 commanderies, each controlled by a military officer who reported to him. He developed the first postal system and developed roads and transportation to help govern the empire. So you can see here, here's just a little graphic of how it worked. The emperor is in charge, and then everybody reported directly to him: his general, his prime minister, the censor, the chamberlains, and all of their roles, they reported directly to him. So imagine trying to unify all of these different states who have different ways of communicating. They have different forms of money, different weights and measures, So what he did was he standardized all of that and said, everybody has to use my system. And that made it easier for the government to function because they could communicate better. They knew when they talked about how much something weighed that they were talking about the same thing, right? They were using the same money. They could travel from place to place and know, it's, how you have to change money from dollars to euros when you go to Europe. And well, within the empire, you did not have to do that. And then there were very large construction projects and much trade between these regions. And now let's talk about the written language of Chinese. So we saw the oracle bones, and by the time you get to the later Shang dynasty, things, there were several different styles of script that had evolved. And so the script wasn't invented during the Qin dynasty, but there was a standardized script that was used for all government communications and all writing. So actually early writing really developed at the end of the Shang and the Warring States periods. Here on the bottom, we can see a Chinese dictionary. It's actually considered to be the first, or it's a later edition of the first Chinese dictionary, which was begun at this time. It's called the Area. Currency. So here we talk about money. So other forms of currency that had been used before Qin were cowrie shells. We can see those on the bottom right. On the upper right, those are called knife blades, and they different weights and sizes of those were worth different amounts. On the left here, this is what Qin instituted and made the common currency of the empire, the ban liang. It's made of bronze, and it has a consistent weight and shape. And you can see down here, here's a mold that they would use to cast the bronze coins. So weights and measures. So originally they were based on the dimensions of the human body, but as we know, they're all different shapes and sizes of human bodies. So they could be inconsistent based on the village and the location. So he standardized what the weight is. So this weight is 1 shi, which is literally 1 stone, or about 132 pounds. So it's like we do it now. We have certain things, I'm not sure where they're kept. We have an Institute of Standards and Measures, I believe, that has what the official weights are in our time of what is 1 pound, and we have a weight. This is 1 pound. This is 1 ounce. So everything is based on that. It's standardized. So there are other things came out of this. So by standardizing, say, the width of an axle on a cart, so it's about 6 feet. So that means that if all the carts are the same width, then all of the wheels run in the same ruts on the road. And so that makes travel much easier. It also standardizes the width that the roads need to be. So if you need to have 2 carts pass each other, then you know that each cart is 6 feet wide. So you know your road has to be larger than 12 feet, probably, so in order for them to pass. And again, time was standardized. So the idea of a clock was standardized. So during this time, the Qin organized these enormous construction projects in order to solidify the power of the emperor. So the construction, as we saw, makes construction much easier. And he built roads and canals. He used slave labor. Almost all the labor was slave labor. People were conscripted and removed from their homes and forced to work. Of course, we've seen that in all civilizations throughout history. Think of Egypt and Rome. And so they didn't have very good living conditions, and they were treated really quite harshly. Here we see an early section of the Great Wall of China. And we'll look at some of the other things. So roads. So he built miles and miles of road. And then this one north-south superhighway that was about 500 miles long. So that all areas of the empire could be reached, not only by the emperor, but by his army and by the citizens of the empire. And this greatly aided, of course, in trade. And the roads were built on raised beds. You can see on the bottom here, this is an old section of road. So it's raised and on tamped earth, and sometimes slate or other stone was laid on the top. And in certain areas, it would be lined with trees to break the wind coming, across, especially these large plains in China, and to offer protection. So the Qin direct path is the north and south artery, and it runs straight and it goes through all different types of terrain, including the mountains. And it was just carved through whatever the landscape was in that area. And there would be regular areas where you could stop and change your horses. And again, this was standardized. They figured out about how far you could travel in a day. And then there would be an outpost there where you could get new horses and spend the night. And this is another segment, old segment of road here in the upper picture. So let's talk about the Great Wall. So there were sections of wall that predated the Qin dynasty. It was to protect those northern provinces from the Mongols and those that lived on the steppes north of China. And so what the Qin did was they were able to connect these existing sections of wall and then fortify them. And they would use a lot of what they could find in the area, stone, earth, wood, everything that they could use to build these sections of wall. Now here, these photos are of the older sections that possibly date back to this time period. And again, hundreds of thousands or more workers or slaves died constructing this wall. And here you can see the on the map, the locations of the wall. This is what it looks like today. The sections really that we think of as the Great Wall of China were built mostly in the Ming Dynasty, 14th to 17th century. Originally, as you see here, it covered over 13,000 miles, but a lot of it has been lost, just between erosion and construction of other projects. So about a third of it has been lost, but here's photos of different segments of it. You can see it actually goes out into the ocean. So the Apong Palace. So this was thought to be a myth for a long time until there were actual foundations discovered. And this is in the area of Xi'an. Here you can see the map here shows you where Xi'an is, which is the capital of the empire and very important in the archaeological studies of China. And there you can see it's built along a river. And this is the art here, this scroll. This is an artist's vision of what they thought Apong would look like. It was never fully completed. It burned down in the following dynasty. But the idea of it resonated throughout history, and the idea of it became the basis for the building of the Forbidden City again later, and we will discuss that more later. So it was huge, and so just one gallery of it could supposedly hold 10,000 people, and there were covered walkways into the mountains. And here you can see this is the archaeological dig where they have found it, and they are digging to find more, and you can see the outlines. So it did actually exist. It was not something that just lived on in legend. So another idea of Qin Shi Huang, he didn't develop it, but this is what he instituted, was this idea of legalism. That his belief in the way he governed was he believed that people were motivated by self-interest. So therefore, they would only behave if they were guided by strict laws. They wouldn't behave or be good naturally out of just morality. So the laws needed to be very strict and narrow in order to control the population, and infractions were heavily punished. So the empire dictated how people would dress, how they would speak and interact with each other. And basically it boils down to the ends justified the means. So this is contrary to Confucianism, which Confucius believed that people were basically good. And so the state was run in the same way a father might run a family. Again, so we're talking, again, about early ideas and a male-dominated society. So I'm going to talk about the father of the family. And so the family operates on mutual obligation and respect, not because someone's going to punish them if they don't do right. So the idea was that there was a rigid hierarchy where everybody knew their place and what their function was, and this would lead to great order and prosperity. But Qin, his empire was based on legalism. And here, this bronze plate here is a set of laws dating back to the Qin dynasty. So you may have all seen photos of this, of the terracotta warriors. Qin had great interest in and a quest for immortality. He had an interest in magic and alchemy in order to prolong his own life. And he did, even though he was the supreme commander and emperor of his state, he did, as he grew older, isolate himself more and more. He was very paranoid that he would be poisoned or murdered. And in fact, it's thought that there were actual assassination attempts made on him. But he was very concerned about his legacy. And again, think about the importance of filial piety in the Chinese society. So he had this burial area. All of these were created for his tomb, and it's enormous. And so all of these warriors and their horses guard the tomb, and the actual tomb has not been unearthed. It has been left untouched, I believe, just so that because as soon as it's unearthed, then it starts to deteriorate. So I don't know if that will ever be excavated or not. At this point, it has not. So these figures are life size, including the horses. They're composed of terracotta clay, and each figure is unique. And the way that they did this was they made them in sections. So they would make torsos, different torsos and different heads, different decor, different legs, different positions, different faces. And then they would kind of mix and match. And so each figure is different than the one next to that. And you can see that in this photograph here, where we see the two different faces and costumes. They were originally painted when they first unearthed them. The paint was more obvious through time. It has deteriorated. So now they just more like the terracotta. And evidently they were originally holding weapons, which have been raided and looted. So here we are. So this is the hall. They've covered them to protect them, but you can see they're in these columns, and just row upon row upon row upon row of warriors. And here we have some of the horses and a chariot. I think this is wonderful. This whole setup here, even with the parasol. And here we have a set of armor. This armor is actually, I believe it to be, it could be jade, and each piece is threaded together. And here is the helmet. So fascinating. I really want to go see that at some point in my life. Maybe some of you have been able to do that. So as the Qin dynasty moved on and he became more and more erratic and weak, he did die. There's some question of whether or not he died of natural causes, but he was succeeded by his son, who was very weak and forced to commit suicide. So there was a very chaotic period at which time another dynasty was able to establish themselves and take over, which is the rise then of the Han dynasty, which was established in 202 BCE. And then we have a reinstatement of Confucianism as opposed to legalism. So what are some of the things that came out of this Qin dynasty and Qin Shi Huang? Well, he is respected as the first uniter of China. He united all of those disparate provinces. And again, the bureaucracy and the administration that he put in place were important, or were the basis for all of the subsequent dynasties in China. They had a model to follow. Again, the civic building projects were very important, the canals and the roads especially. He was, unfortunately, he harshly treated his subjects and his slaves. And there was a loss of cultural history. And I feel like I'm missing a slide here, but anyway. There was something called the burning of the books, which it's thought that he gathered up all of the texts and writings throughout the empire and had them burned, and the work of the scholars burned, especially anything that disagreed with him that had to do with Confucianism. But then it has been discovered that he at least created a library of all of these items. So he did save their texts, even though he had them burned so that the public couldn't access them. And it's also thought that the Han victors maybe overstated his cruelty and his harshness. So we don't necessarily know what exactly was true and what not. Again, as is true of, think of, most history, or behind a certain point where, and that's always true. The victor writes the history. So here we move into the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE. So here we're talking about 400 years, much longer than the short Qin Dynasty. And you can see here the Western Han Dynasty. And again, the dotted line in the map is the current border of modern day China. So they reestablished Confucianism, and they continued to strengthen the central rule. I believe those objects there are coins. Those are Han Dynasty coins. So again, they continued that idea originated by the Qin. So this is a tomb panel that from the 2nd century. You can see basically there's some warriors, and there's a figure on the left that is the Queen Mother, and it shows how the heavenly court is the heavenly court and the earthly organization court supposedly echo each other. And on the top we have, this is wonderful. This is like an animal pen with figures of animals, and it dates from the 1st to 3rd century. And in there's some goats, there's a mother carrying an infant. There are Ming Qi, or spirit utensils, or spirit objects that accompany the deceased in the burials in the Han Dynasty. And there were often other, lots of utilitarian objects and entertainers, all kinds of things to provide nourishment, entertainment, and to help the soul of the tomb occupant, and food and so on. So, and you'll be hearing more about that. So the Han Dynasty really reached its height under the Emperor Wu Di. Di is a suffix that indicates it's an emperor. And I also believe that it correlates to the word for deity, that the emperor was considered a deity. So they dominated here all the way from Korea to South Vietnam. It's an age where poetry and literature and philosophy flourished. There was a great history of China written by Sima Qian. And again, that's how we know some of the things that we know about the first emperor. The capital was Shangan, which is Xi'an that we saw on the previous map. So at this time, Rome and Shangan were the two largest cities in the ancient world. Unfortunately, nature comes into play here, and the Yellow River changed its course in 11 of the Common Era, which then led to people being displaced, not having enough food. And of course, what happens when you have that situation, you have uprising among the peasants. And it was around this time that this first century era that Buddhism first starts to be introduced to China. So at this time of the flood, the Han capital is moved to Luoyang, and this is now considered the Eastern Han dynasty, but they never really had the same level of power and influence after that. So there's a very important person at this time, Shang Yan. He was the first person to basically leave, or not the first person, obviously, but he was an important person who left China and traveled and explored and then returned to the court of China to report on other civilizations and populations outside of China. He was actually sent by the emperor to establish relations with other groups, the Central Asian tribal groups. And of course, he got captured because, he's somebody else from a different society, and he was gone for about 10 years. But he was able to gather information on all these areas with Greece, Alexander the Great, and open some trade between the different states. So the Han were able to reach out as far as, I think, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, all to the west. And they maintained or started relations with the Fergana Valley, which was a rich area for these wonderful horses. And so they started to import and trade for these beautiful horses known as heavenly horses. So the Silk Roads were established during this time, or the early editions of the Silk Roads. Now, we talked about this, of course, last semester when we talked about India, but the Silk Road, it's a network of roads. It isn't one trail that extends from China to Europe. It is a network of roads. And it's not that people traveled the entire length. They might travel from one area to another area, and then other people would trade there, and then those people would then travel to other areas along the Silk Roads. And later in time, there was a sea version of the Silk Roads. Here you can see those routes in blue. So what kinds of things were traded on the Silk Roads? Well, moving west from China would be things like silk, tea, spices, ivory, porcelain, lacquer, all of that. And the things moving east, things like horses, grapes, animal furs, honey, fruits, wool. So it was not just objects, though, that were traded. So you can imagine, with all these different cultures coming together, working together to trade, that also great ideas passed between the East and the West. And a lot of this was based on the fact that Rome wanted the Chinese silk. This is something that they didn't produce themselves, and the Chinese really held on to the knowledge of how silk was produced. And so in order to get the Chinese silk, Rome was willing, they traded many things. And this is where the name came from. It was actually coined in the 19th century, the term Silk Roads. And this is how Buddhism first moved from India into China. So let's talk about silk. It was produced as far back as the Stone Age, or what is called Neolithic China, from the filaments of the cocoon of the silkworm. And so there's evidence of sericulture is the making of silk. So there's evidence that it existed as far back as 3600 BCE, perhaps even further back. So for most of its history, it has been China's most important export. It's used for many different things. Of course, we know about luxurious clothing, fans, think also wall hangings, banners. It was also used, it was painted on, used like paper to create artworks. It was even used, a certain kind of silk was used as payment, almost as money. And a single silkworm can produce a 0.025 millimeter thread. So think, very, very, very thin thread, 900 meters long. And then the filaments are twisted together to produce the thread that's thick enough to be used to weave. And usually this is, most of the silk making is women's work. And you see here a small scrap of silk that dates back to the Shang dynasty. And silk from China has been found in Egyptian tombs. Actually, I'm sorry, this dates back to the Zhou dynasty from 348 BCE. So a very ancient piece of silk. Here we have our silkworm on the upper left here. And we have another one here with the cocoons. You can see the silk cocoons here. And so during the Han Dynasty is when the quality of the silk really improved. They really figured out the processes to make it finer and stronger. And they started dyeing the threads. And you can see on the right here some embroidered patterns. Actually, the upper image is a close-up of the lower image. So you can see this very, very fine embroidery in different colors. And in the inset here is a funerary banner of painted silk. That's not woven or embroidered, it's actually painted. And it was found in the same tomb. This pattern, this embroidered pattern on the gold silk is called longevity, and it's profiles of dragons amongst rolling clouds. And you can kind of see that. It took about 200 pounds of mulberry leaves to produce 1 pound of silk. So mulberry leaves are the diet of the silkworms. That's all they eat. So it takes about 2,000 to 3,000 cocoons to make 1 pound of silk. So you can understand why it's such an intensive process and why it's considered a luxury and very expensive. So the technique and process of silk making was a carefully guarded secret, controlled by the Chinese authorities, because of course, if the secret gets out, then they lose their trading power. So, if the Roman Empire figures out, hey, we can make silk ourselves, then they're no longer trading it. So another important development during the Han Dynasty was the development of the civil exams, which really influenced the social structure all the way through the end of the Qing Dynasty in 1911. So it's believed, the imperial court believed that their rule was mandated by heaven. And then below the imperial court, there are different levels of commoners. There's the civil and the military. And 4 classes: the learned or scholarly class, the government officials and literati, the peasants, which is of course the vast majority of the population, along with the laborers and artisans. And then the merchants, of course, were the wealthiest. But the only way to move up through the ranks was to take this civil exam and pass this civil exam. And they were held every 4 to 6 years. And I've noted here that, maybe they could be delayed for up to 10. So you would spend, you would have to determine, or your parents would have to determine early in your life that this was what they wanted for you. And it would take years and years of study to reach the point where you could pass this exam. And it wasn't that many people that are that great of a percentage of people that actually did pass the exam to move into the scholarly or literati class. So yeah, the empire was weakened. We saw there was the flood. They moved their capital. There was war, plague, all of the same things that, you've seen throughout history that that cause nations to fall. And so we enter this 6 dynasties period where the Han lost their power, and then there was fragmentation again. So the North, unfortunately, or not unfortunately, it's just the way that it was dominated by invaders from the borderlands and the steppes. Remember, this has happened. This happens a number of times throughout Chinese history. So there starts to be an influx of people who were not ethnically Han and spoke a variety of languages. And this continued, this contributed to the disunity. So all of these efforts to unify the Chinese people are starting to fall apart at this point. So there was a succession of dynasties during this period. Nobody could hold power for very long. But the connections to India were still very powerful by means of the Silk Roads, and Buddhism is starting to come in, and it continues to spread and become more influential, partly because times were so difficult and Buddhism offered a way of thinking that offered hope and a structure for reaching enlightenment and bringing you hope, peace and prosperity. So here we have another one of these giant cave sculptures carved out of rock in Buddhist shrine. So this dates from 460 to 465 in Yungang, the Yungang grottos. So the Sui dynasty comes at the end of this period, of this chaotic period. And you can see it's very short here, 581 to 618, Common Era. So again, really only about less than 40 years. So only 2 emperors, and but they were able to, again, pull together these disparate regions and reunified China. And they did this with a large army and a large fleet, and including these enormous ships that could carry up to 800 men. And they returned to this centralized idea, this centralized government to unify these different regions. A law code that everyone followed. Everybody had the same form of laws. They introduced land reforms. They tolerated all religions, and they started to rebuild from the period of war. They rebuilt the wall, improved the canals that had been started under the Qin dynasty. But again, there came the military losses, another peasant rebellion. And so then the Sui dynasty falls when the emperor is assassinated in 617. So I think it's time to take a break. We have another half hour. I'm hoping I can get this done in half an hour. Is 5 minutes enough, or do you need 10? Anybody?
5.
5.
5?
Five's enough.
Okay, so let's say 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and finish this up. We have a lot to cover.
How are you holding up, Michelle?
I'm doing good.
All right, good.
Yeah,
Looks like you have a new hairdo.
I do. I got my hair cut in honor of class beginning.
Yeah. My
How are
wife
you
made me
doing?
get a haircut too. Getting pretty
How are
ragged.
you doing, Ray?
I'm
Yeah.
I'm good. I had a little issue with macular degeneration,
Oh
but
dear.
yeah, but I think it might not be age related, but I've had 3 shots into my eyeball
Ooh.
and it seemed to have fixed the problem. So I'm feeling pretty grateful.
Yeah, I know that can be very difficult to
Yeah.
deal with.
So
Yeah, good luck.
one question I have is, am I allowed to come in for the gallery exercises?
Okay, so the deal with mentors, we would like you to come occasionally, and we would like to be notified when you want to come because we are trying to keep the numbers down.
Okay.
And obviously, I would think you would want to come when
Oral?
Richard is giving an oral and for things like that, and for some of the exercises. And absolutely, I mean, you're welcome to come, but please notify me so that I can control really how many people.
Okay.
The issue, but and you're always, of course, invited to these sessions, and you'll always get an invitation.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to know what the new regime is teaching, right?
Yeah, that's
than
right.
keep telling everybody what we learned, and it's good to know the updated info.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go back to being anonymous.
It'll take another couple of minutes, but if anybody's there and has questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Michelle, I'd just like to share with you something that you mentioned in the class. You're
Oh, yes.
wondering you are wondering why Lao Tzu is riding a cow?
Yes.
Yeah, there's in Chinese a lot of gods. They're riding different different animals, and those animals always represent some of their uh, status or their philosophy. So Lao Tzu, he believed people should live harmony with the earth, and the heaven and the earth, and he doesn't like to fight with other people. It's just like the cow. Cow carry a lot of heavy burden. They never complain and they don't fight. That's why he riding the cow.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah. Okay. So, so a lot of them then were associated with animals, you're saying? So what would like Confucius have been?
Confucius doesn't have animal, but a lot of in Chinese there are all different kinds of god, just like some of them are like a legendary stories, like the eight I'm talking about what 8,000 mortals. They
Immortals.
all riding different animals, and all
Yeah.
those animal has different meaning. The animal will be best represent this god's characters.
Okay. Okay. Great. Did you all hear that? Are you all back online? I can't tell.
Yes,
Yes.
I
Yeah.
heard it. Thank you.
Yeah,
Jojo.
that was very interesting. Yeah. Yes, Jojo has an extensive background. She actually teaches tell the class what you teach, Jojo.
Well, I'm teaching American-born Chinese about Chinese cultures in a very simple way, not really complicated way, and hope they can connect their life here in the United States with the ancient Chinese history and cultures.
Okay.
So I teach them something like Chinese calligraphy, like Chinese characters, and also some of the Chinese mythologies, all those like Chinese calendars, and of course the traditional festivals and holidays, like the Moon Festival is coming in September 21st. And for the past 3,000 years, Chinese people all celebrate this holiday. Why do people still doing this? So I'm trying to tell the kids, why do we celebrate that?
Wonderful. Okay, I think we should move on. Again, I'm going to try to get through all of this today. We still have a lot to cover, but okay, so let's move into the Tang Dynasty. So now we're moving forward in time to the 7th to the 10th centuries. So think about where the West was at this point. The Western Roman Empire had fallen by the end of the 5th century, and Europe is in, what we often call the Dark Ages. And so in China, we're about to enter a time that was a golden age, and it's a time of economic prosperity, expansion, stability. So when you have stability, a lot of things can grow. And so art and literature really flourished at this point, and it's considered to be among China's finest. We also have foreign religions that are tolerated, and of course, Buddhism is continuing to expand and take root in China. So the capital is still Shangan or Xi'an at this point, and it is the largest city in the world, over 1 million people by the 7th century. Here we have some examples of Tang painting. So art and ceramics became very well developed, and there were new techniques developed during these times. And but more important than that, there was an appreciation of art as a worthy human endeavor. There was an official at court who was in charge of searching out artists and artworks. There were different schools to train artists. one of them is the Han Lin Academy, which has been very important in China. And there was a history of art written by Shang Yan Yuan in 847. So because of this stability, the arts were able to grow and be more appreciated. And the Tong art, not just is an expression of artistic skill or a reproduction of reality, it is also represents the artist's good character. It reflects his character and shows his virtue, not just his skill. And during this time, a landscape art becomes important, and the addition of emotion and mood enters into painting. And think about Taoism and the connection to nature. You know, that's seen here in these landscape paintings. And here, of course, we have a painting of and these paintings are both on silk, of these two women. I'm not quite sure what they're doing there. She's got some kind of pointer and an animal down there on the ground. I don't know. So here are some examples of Tong earthenware. This is the time where different glazes were experimented with. All of these objects are from the Met. So notice this beautiful tricolor glaze, the green, the white, and the copper or the orange brown. This is known as the Sansai glaze, this three-color glaze, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that as we move into ceramics and porcelain. And we have some objects in our museum that have this same glaze on it. And then we also have this amphora on the right that is a white glaze. And in the center, of course, we have this wonderful rooster in the Sansai glaze. So there's a great deal of experimentation and variety in ceramics at this time. So here we have an important person in history, Xuanzang, who was a Buddhist monk. And he got permission to travel to India and learn what he could from the origin of Buddhism, right? Because that's where Buddhism started. And he spent some time in India, and he brought back writings and objects important to the Buddha, and he brought them to China. And it was a 17-year overland journey. And then he stayed there for some time. And this pagoda here, so a pagoda is a Buddhist building, a religious building, and it stores the sutras and relics that he brought back. And this pagoda is in Xi'an and was built in 652. The Diamond Sutra. So according to the British Museum, this is currently the known oldest printed book. So this is a woodblock print created from a carving on wood. It's a 17.5-foot scroll. And in Chinese, you read opposite way that we do. You read from the right to the left. So that so scrolls and artworks are the same way. Whenever you see a Chinese artwork, from a painting to a scroll like this, you start from the right and look towards the left to understand it. And this is a discourse on the Buddha, or actually the Buddha himself in this image is giving a discourse to those around him. And you can see on the left there, the inclusion of the Chinese characters. And this is something you'll see over and over again in Chinese painting, the combination of calligraphy, language, and representational art. So moving on to the Song dynasty, they didn't expand, they didn't grow in territory, but they were economically very wealthy. And at this time, China is the wealthiest nation in the world. So again, think about this time period. This is around the turn of the first millennium, so around 1000 CE in the Western world. Again, so China is very advanced compared to our Western civilization at this point in history. So the northern kingdoms were very strong at this point, and the Song actually lost territory. And then the subsequent remaining dynasty was known as the Southern Song, and you can see that down here. This is the area of the Southern Song. So they've lost a lot of these northern territories. So again, as I mentioned, they were quite wealthy, and this developed through communication and trade, again, along the Silk Roads. And they started new processes of mass production and distribution of important commodities like salt, iron, porcelain. So porcelain is starting to be developed now. And again, well, we'll see some examples of porcelain in a little while, and you will have some lectures on exactly what is porcelain and how is it made and what is that process and why is it important. So during this time, because of the economic boom, a middle class started to emerge between the wealthy elite and the laborers and peasants. And so the Song were the first to issue actual paper money. So we've seen a lot of coins, but the paper money, of course, is a lot easier to produce. They have the technology to print, and they have paper. And so they were able to issue banknotes. And again, the civil service exam continues to be important. And in fact, it takes on more importance now than it had even in the past. And this image is the posting of the examination results, or this is a detail of it. So all of these young men are coming in to find out if they have passed the exam. This is ink on silk from 1540. So here are some of the things that were established during the Song dynasty. So they had a large navy, and one of the reasons they were able to do this was the development of the compass. Now the Han had invented a compass that you see on the lower right there, and that spoon-like object is lodestone, and it's on a bronze plate, and it is what we call a south pointer, because that pointer actually points toward the south. And the plate that it's on is called the heaven plate, or the diviner's board, and it had designs, and it had the I Ching, which is important in Chinese literature, and the 24 directions, the constellations, and so on, and the houses of the moon, the different phases of the moon. Now the Song, they modified it. They figured out how to magnify the compass needle. And so then they had a needle that was straight, and they were pointing north and south, of course, because if you have a needle and you're pointing north, and you're also pointing south. So the steel needle would be magnetized by rubbing it with the lodestone. And then they would put it on an apparatus that then floated so that it could turn easily, but it could be held in a mounting and contained. So it was more easily portable and more easily used aboard ship. So, so that obviously became very important as far as navigation. So during this time period, they also invented movable type, meaning individual characters that could then be moved and then reused and rearranged to print different texts. There was a growth in importance between rice and tea, and in the trade of rice and tea. Remember, so the Southern Song now are down more in that southern area where the rice is important. And at this time, there was the development of the foot binding among upper class women, and we'll take a look at that here. So this is how it worked. So there actually, as young girls, their feet would be broken. So here you can see this is a normal foot. It would be broken. and then bound until the girls stopped growing in order to create what they thought to be beautiful in these small dainty feet in these little shoes. But you can see, obviously, this was a very, probably very painful and very destabilizing for the women. I imagine it was very difficult to walk. They probably couldn't run. So kind of that shows you about the position of women in the society. These were called lotus feet. And during the Song period, it was really only the women of the elite classes, but then it started to spread, and it continued all the way through the Qing dynasty in the early 20th century. At some point, it's considered that probably 50% of all Chinese women would have had bound feet. And among the upper classes, it would have been 100%. Clearly, the peasants working out in the fields and so on, this wouldn't have been practical for them, but it's just one of those things. So here we go into tea, the production of tea. It's thought that the Chinese drank tea as far back as 3,000 years ago, maybe further, beginning as a medicine. The Song dynasty improved the processing methods for tea. There was actually a trade. You could trade tea for horses and vice versa. Now, I don't know how much tea it took to get a horse. That would be an interesting thing to know. But really, even now, of course, it's the primary beverage in every Chinese household. And on the left here, we have different types of green tea. Of course, the tea is the same plant, but the way it's processed determines what kind of tea it is, whether it's white, green, oolong, or black tea. And then it could be processed into balls. It could be ground into the compressed tea. On the left here, or I'm sorry, on the right, we have a plaque that is describing the processing of the tea. And of course, we have a field of the plant of the tea growing. So Emperor Weizhong promoted Taoism, and he was very talented himself. He studied poetry and painting and all of the important arts, calligraphy and music. He brought artists to his court and fostered the arts. So this painting of the bird here is actually thought to be painted by him. He also founded the first imperial art collection, and being a Taoist, he promoted the observance of art in nature. So the producing art that reflected nature became important during his time. He was defeated by the Jin dynasty from the north, and his entire court was captured and transported to Manchuria, which is up north, where they all died. His son fled south, and so this is part of the loss of the territory and the formation of the Southern Song. This also is thought to be by the emperor. We don't know, of course, if he actually did it himself or if it was created under his direction. But this is auspicious cranes dating from the 12th century. And he promoted the form of writing into an art form. And you can see this elegant style of characters that was called slender gold. And again, this continued combination of poetry, calligraphy, and painting. Again, here's a landscape painting on the left. And you can see the Southern Song painting is gentle, a lot of open space in between. And then this Northern Song painting, which is a very different style, more powerful, and the painting is denser. You can see it doesn't have the gentle open space that the Southern Song painting exhibits. Both of these are ink on silk. Now we're going to talk about the Yuan dynasty. So the Yuan dynasty originates in Mongolia. This is the Mongol Empire in 1207. So this is the northern part of China. And now we have, you can see the Mongol Empire in 1241. So they've moved from this, I'm sorry, I can't get my, here we go. This central area of Mongolia, and they've spread out in all directions and conquered this area of Central Asia. And so how did this happen? So Temujin, who took the title of Genghis Khan, and here are his dates, unified the Mongolian clans in 1206. Now, he had a lot of ambition and he was a military genius, and he really had no scruples. So he was all about expanding the empire. And at its greatest size in 1260, it was about 10 million square miles, which if you compare to Rome, the Roman Empire at its height under the Emperor Trajan was 2 million square miles. So 5 times the size of the Roman Empire. Now, it didn't stay that size for very long. And he really was just all about destruction. And they were all on cavalry, and they would ride in and they would tell the people of the area that they were conquering, you either accept us or we just wipe you out. So this resulted in great demographic changes and also a decline in population, as you can imagine, between the actual killing and then the raiding of food and so on. The army, as I said, was 100% cavalry. You can see a soldier here on the bottom left. He's riding his horse and facing backwards with his bow and arrow. They had superb marksmanship and riding skills, and they were all about moving fast. So their armor was lightweight. They didn't carry food. They hunted as they went along. They would drink milk from the horses and even blood. And as the horses died, they would even eat the horses. But they would also raid, right? They would take the food and then plunder wherever they were going through. So they had very advanced weaponry. On the right here, we can see different swords. They had, bows and arrows, different kinds of arrows, depending on if they were hunting or killing or what they intended. The invention of gunpowder was around this time. They could throw grenades, right, with their arrows. They had spies in the different areas they were going into, and terrorism. So, this was not a good time. You didn't want to run across the army of Genghis Khan during this time. So become a vassal or be annihilated. So, so they came in from Mongolia and came into the Song dynasty. And upon his death, Genghis's death in 1227, the Mongol Empire was divided up among his descendants. So then it's divided, and then there's rivalry between them. Well, his grandson, the Kublai Khan, conquered the southern Song in 1279 and declared himself the emperor of China. And so this becomes the Yuan dynasty. Yuan means origin. So his empire was smaller than the entire Mongol empire because of the division between the descendants. But he then declares, as I said, declares himself the emperor of China. So the Yuan dynasty is considered a transitional age in the development of porcelain. So porcelain had started to be developed amongst the Tang and the Song. And then the Mongols continued the development of this pottery and developed new ways of processing it. So the porcelain is made from kaolin clay, which is found in China, and it's what gives it the whiteness and its strength. So porcelain is well, this porcelain probably wasn't transparent or translucent because at this time the porcelain was quite thick. But the porcelain consisted of a white body and then an opaque glaze that was fired at a very high temperature. This is part of the definition of porcelain. And again, you will hear a lot more about this. So the center of porcelain production becomes Zhengdezhen, which is in central China. And here we see some examples from this time period. So we see this underglaze white with the blue that comes from cobalt, and we often see this red that is here in this central vessel. So yes, those are the most representative, and the decoration, this fine decoration, becomes finer and finer. And these yuan objects tend to be, as I said, heavier and quite large in size. They're less, the shapes are less refined than the song, and later the shapes become more refined as we move forward. During this time period, we also see a refinement of painting. Again, the Yuan dynasty, there's more expression of the spirit and the soul of the artist in the art. The scholar artists, the literati, were really the lead figures in painting, and they emphasized the expressive qualities inherent in the brush and in the ink. So they were portraying personality, thought, and emotions. This painting is by Wang Gongwang. It's called The Dwelling in the Fuchun Mountains. And so this is ink on paper. So we have paper at this point. We'll talk about that a little more in a while. And he's used brush and ink. And and remember, we moved from the right and then moved to the left. And it's visually, we have all kinds of methods and techniques that are shown here. We see bold tones and subtle shades. We see wet brushwork and dry brushwork. And we have dense areas and more sparse areas. And we have different line qualities depending on how the artist used the brush. It's also during this time period that Marco Polo came to China, and he's more important to the West, of course, than he is to the East. But he was a Venetian born in the 13th century. He came from a family of explorers, actually, and he went to China with his father and his uncle, and they traveled overland. So the father and the uncle had extensive experience traveling all throughout the Ottoman Turkish Empire and in further east into China. And when they were there, they were in China for 17 years, and they actually worked for the Kublai Khan as an envoy. And so it's not just that they were in one area of China, they traveled all over China and all over the empire. At a certain point, they were asked to escort a Mongol princess to Persia to be married, and they did that and then returned to Venice in 1295. So they weren't the first Europeans, obviously, to go to China, but they really captured the imagination of the West with their tales of China and what they had seen, and the tales of the wealth of the Chinese emperor and the technological advancements of the time. And so it really encouraged, at this time that that Europe was starting this age of exploration. China really captured their imagination. So that is why we consider Marco Polo to be important. So we move from the Yuan dynasty into the Ming dynasty. And at this point, we can see here the extent of the Ming dynasty and the placement of the Great Wall of China, which they expanded and rebuilt. And then the dotted outline is the outline of the current country of China. So how did the Mongols fall? Well, there was a rebel, a Chinese rebel, Zhu Yuanzhang, who led the rebellion that drove out the Mongol emperor. So Ming means bright, And during this time, the wealth and power of China increased. They moved the capital to Beijing, which is of course where it is now, and they're responsible for the construction of the Forbidden City. There was great technical advancement in the decorative arts at this point. We're reaching 1 o'clock. I do have a few more slides. Do you want, this would be a good place to stop if people want to stop, and we can maybe continue this next week. I have about 15 to 20 more slides. Does that sound like a plan?
Stop.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I know you're all exhausted. We've gone over so much. I'll start here. Let me stop the share. I will start with the Ming Dynasty next week. It's a good point to stop. I don't want to exhaust all of you on your first day of class. But I will quickly take questions if you have them, either about the class itself, the procedures, or about the lecture, if there's anything. Okay.
Just enjoyable, Michelle. It was interesting and
Good, I'm glad.
long, but very interesting.
So I just want to talk a little bit. So Wednesday, what we're going to do on Wednesday. So we're going to all be at the museum. Angela will be there from 9:30 to 10 to let people in down into the basement. So you returning people know how to get into the back of the museum. We've discussed this with the freshmen. You should be able to find it. It shouldn't be a problem. And so you can put all your things in the office. We will move upstairs at that point and take pictures and so on and have a lecture from Betty. So anybody have any questions about that? Think they'll have difficulty finding the back door?
Not.
Okay, great. So thank you all. And Pam and I are rapidly getting all the last documents ready for the website. So that should be up to date and get started. Take a look at what you're